She has a wildly shaped blade and a love for the night. Today, we will examine Diana, Scion of the Moon. Hi, I'm Patrick. Welcome to Runeterra Tourist. I don't know anything about these people yet, so let's learn about them together. During previous season for Unleashed, I was already growing interested in her with the blue-purple color combination and her legend ability, and that's before I even knew anything about her. From what I gather, Diana is a very beloved and respected character in League of Legends, and she's not one of those typical frustrating pub stompers that I've heard about. She was designed story first, originally crafted as a foil for Leona, and then took a life on her own, and apparently there are more details about her in other character story like Nami's, which I kind of had to gather by myself there once I realized that I wasn't getting a lot of information on her bio page. But from what's available, her lore and the Diana-Leona dynamic are genuinely beloved, and she was also the first openly LGBTQIA+ champion in League of Legends, apparently modeled after Lady Gaga from what I've heard, according to one of the designers. Was that part of the reason why I liked her? Not necessarily, but it is an interesting tidbit. So what does the lore look like, and how compelling are her cards? Orphaned as an infant, Diana was found swaddled between her frost-claimed parents, strangers to this land who clearly traveled far. And it's already a mystery as to where she actually came from. The lore kind of leaves this open, but all we really know is that she was never fully of the world that raised her. The Solari hunters brought her into the temple, dedicated her, raised her as Rakur, the tribes of the last son. I'm pretty sure I'm saying that incorrectly. But she went through rigorous physical and religious training from childhood. And unlike every other student, Diana just could not accept what she was being told. She needed to understand why the Solari believed what they believed. And so she spent her nights reading by moonlight in the library, which seems a little too perfect of a detail, but I'll leave that to the lore tellers. But she began to notice these tomes with whole chapters torn out and every reference to the moon removed. She would ask questions. Teachers assigned punishments to her every time she did, though, to exhaust her into devotion. But during class presentations, there was an upcoming festival of Nightless Eve. Diana was surprised that another student, Leona, would debate the presenter, Sabina, notably considering the night somber, not evil, which is what she had been frequently told. And the two would pass notes to one another. There's a little bit of lore about the hesitancy in which they would speak to one another. Diana didn't want to burden Leona with her, the fact that she was this black sheep of the Solari. And so one day in the hidden alcove, Diana found depictions of sun-armored warriors and moon-armored warriors fighting alongside each other, proof that the Solari and Lunari were not always enemies. And so she ran to Leona with the news, and Leona's response was basically to silence her and tell her that she should keep that to herself, otherwise she would face punishment. And of course, crestfallen, Diana ends up separating from Leona, then going on to try to find out information and more details on her own. So Diana made the decision that if no one was going to help her find the truth, she'd find it herself. And so she would climb Mount Targon, which is a harrowing trek to survive in itself. But at the summit, she saw the brightest, fullest moon she had ever seen. A pillar of moonlight crashed into her, and the aspect of the moon chose her as its mortal host. And apparently this is something that frequently happens to those who actually are able to achieve the summit of Mount Targon, which is why so few survive. But the visions it gave her were of the history of the Lunari, the suppressed faith, and the truth the Solari had buried for generations. And she noticed that she wasn't alone at the summit. Leona was also there too. And so Diana was initially excited about this and pleaded with her, telling them that they should leave together, start something new, bring the two faiths back together. But Leona, being the most devout that she is to the Solari, refused, and she chose her people and told Diana to return to face the consequences. So rather than doing that, Diana decided to strike down the only person that she had ever loved, when apparently in another story you find out that Diana had the opportunity to actually kill Leona but chose not to. Interestingly enough, that's not in the backstory on her own page, but you know, you dig around, you can find some stuff about it. Anyway, Diana returned to the temple and confronted the high priests with what she had discovered, and of course, as they are wont to do, they called her a heretic, a blasphemer, a follower of false gods, and the aspect within her amplified her rage, and this time she decided to embrace it, whereas she was able to resist against Leona, and through a burst of moonlight, she eviscerated all the priests. Realizing what she had done, she fled the temple alone. So there's some interesting beats that end up happening that aren't actually discussed on her backstory, but they're discussed in others, and it's how she had fled to go to Ionia, but then it doesn't even really get into what she was doing there, but eventually she returns to Mount Targon and finds Lunari followers that were emerging out of hiding. They were inspired by her arrival as the new aspect of the moon, and so she ended up having these devout followers. And a Lunari Shadestalker named Lyra was captured by the Solari, and there's a whole separate story about how Diana joined the rescue mission. There is a story or an animation that talks about how Lyra had fallen in love with a Solari boy and that they had fled together, and in the midst of their chase, an arrow struck Lyra at Dragon's Roost, and then Diana watched the moon eclipse the sun at that moment, and the two lovers were ascended into the sky, becoming constellations. There's also a weird thing where Diana and Leona were apparently, they just dropped everything and decided to pursue these two lovers. So they end up seeing each other in two different parts of Dragon's Roost, and they just leave it at that. They don't fight, they don't do anything. It's an interesting animation. But because she does not fully control her aspect powers, Diana can cause great destruction when her emotions overwhelm her, and she is still learning what exactly she is. And she's not seeking revenge, which is an interesting aspect to her story and her character. Instead, she's seeking peace and a purpose that she doesn't fully understand. And so the early lore was a little bit sparse about that. Riot started to flesh that out considerably, especially when there was a lot of fan attention about Diana and her dynamic with Leona. And so the Diana-Leona story is now one of the richer relationships in Riot and the whole universe. It's tragic, it's complicated, it's unresolved, and it remains unresolved because Riot hasn't really filled in any more details out of all the opportunities that they have had yet. Fingers crossed they will, maybe one day. But Diana's opposite and mirror image being Leona, the aspect of the sun, where Diana is the aspect of the moon, and being former lovers, now ideologically opposed, it would be an interesting story for them to follow up on. So now that we know a little bit more about Diana, let's take a look at some of the cards in Riftbound and see how it relates to what her legend abilities are, and if it really matches her flavor of her backstory and what kind of champion she was in League of Legends. So looking at her legend ability, you would exhaust a legend card to add one energy that can only be spent during showdowns. And from what I've gathered in League of Legends, she is kind of a showdown champion, diving into the middle of combat and effectively detonating. So I feel like this legend ability that reserves power specifically for combat moments is thematically coherent. She builds towards an explosive moment and releases it. And I think this card captures that rhythm pretty effectively. Moving on to the signature spell, Moonfall pulls an enemy unit into the battlefield, giving them -2 might in the turn. And in League of Legends, Moonfall is her ultimate. It's the gravitational pulse that draws all nearby enemies towards her, then detonates Moonlight if she is able to pull at least one champion. Moonfall is the ability that defines who Diana is in combat. She pulls the world toward her, and the moon effectively answers the aspect of the moon. So let's take a look at the champion, starting with the purple epic, Diana No Longer Human. So she has the ambush ability, and when you play a spell, give me +2 might this turn. So this feels like an upgraded Ravenbloom student, but for purple, which is excellent, just what purple needs. It's a lot more help. But it looks like it maps to Lunar Rush, which is the dash ability that she has in League of Legends because of the ambush keyword. So she appears suddenly in the battlefield. So that's one way that I interpret it. but the spell triggered Might gain is actually more like Moonsilver Blade in a way, her passive in League of Legends. So when she casts spells, it grants her the speed to charge up her passive, empowering her next basic attack. So Riot embedded that passive mechanic into the champion unit rather than a signature spell, which is good because I feel like that would not really tie in very well to her overall, especially with Moonfall. I feel like Moonfall is the stronger signature spell play. So this is Riot doing their homework, letting Moonsilver Blade not disappear, but rather just be placed into the champion unit. Taking a look at her other champion unit, Diana Lunari, it's the blue rare. This one kind of feels like a little bit of a miss here. So you can see the card, when a showdown begins here, you may pay 1 energy to predict, then potentially draw a spell from the top of your deck. And this card feels a little bit more generic, like a blue mind spell smoothing tool, rather than something specifically that captures Diana character or abilities. And it's the rare, so it makes sense that it's a little bit more functional and flavorful, but there's no real obvious League of Legends comparison that I've been able to see, and so this doesn't really map as cleanly. And honestly, this feels like a miss. It's a useful card, but it could belong to almost anyone here. So what's the verdict on Diana? Well, I was already interested in her before because of the legend ability and the blue-purple combination, but after learning more about her, I can definitely see the draw and the appeal. Genuinely moved by the story, the orphan who never belonged, the friend who betrayed her for the institution, the loss of control that destroyed the very people that she was trying to reach. And so it's a pretty standard classic tragedy, but Riot did well on the cards. I think the choice for Moonfall as a signature spell was really good. The Moonsilver Blade as a passive embedded into the champion unit felt right. And so I think that there was a lot more thoughtful design in Diana than I've seen in other champions, which I'll get to in a future time. The one thing with Diana Lunari being a miss isn't really a deal breaker. I still feel like overall the lore really was reflected in how they developed Diana. So I came into this not knowing anything about Diana except that her cards looked really cool, and now I'm leaving with a lot more respect for her story. And it's really interesting that I now have all these questions about Leona too. I only really know about her from playing against the legend in Nexus Knights, so it'd be interesting to learn a little bit more, and maybe that's a future video down the line, a little teaser for you, I guess. But I really respect that Diana has her own story now, even though she was really just going to be a foil for one of the other characters. They've really fleshed her out into an interesting way that I'm excited to actually get to know a little bit more about her. So how did I do? What did I miss? What about her story really resonates with you? And for the League of Legends players, how did Riot do in translating her abilities over into Riftbound? Let me know in the comments below because I'd really like to learn more. That's it for now. Tune in next time as I continue to explore more of the lore in Runeterra and its champions.